Hi everyone, welcome back to Ship or Snip. So we asked you for your feedback. We wanted to know what you were watching and what you wanted us to talk about, and you voted for Dead to Me on Netflix. So that's exactly what we're doing. You asked for it. Here we are. This week we are talking about Dead to Me. Renee,
Yes,
are you excited?
I'm so excited. I watched the first season, binged it in like a weekend, and then the second season came out, did the same thing. And when all of you voted for Dead to Me, what I did was rewatch both seasons.
I love
So
it.
I was super pumped. I was super pumped.
So we're talking about Judy and Steve today. And it's important to realize throughout the show, throughout season 1, season 2, we don't see a lot of Judy and Steve, right? We're introduced to them after they've already broken up and had a relationship prior to when we get to meet them. And so, we're going forward with the information that we have, but it's also important to know that like we don't get to see how they met, and the scenes that we do see of them in like real time on the show or in the present day is after they've broken up.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that they have only recently broken up because their breakup follows the timeline of when Judy meets another main character in the show, Jen. So they meet at a grief group approximately 3 months after Jen's husband dies from a hit and run. And skipping forward a little bit, we come to find out that Judy was actually the driver. So that was a big shock, I think, to all of the viewers. But with that, we also find out not only was Judy the driver of the car that hit and killed Jen's husband, but that her former partner, Steve, was in the car as well and influenced her to just keep on driving.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think uh, what we can see in this show between Judy and Steve is likely a few years into their relationship. And so a lot of patterns and a lot of themes have already become solidified throughout their time together. One of those themes that we see between them is the theme of emotional manipulation.
Yeah.
So Steve continuously uses Judy's kindness and Judy's love as a tool to convince her to protect him. We know that they were both in the car that night when Jen's husband died. And so there's a lot riding on this for both of them. Their safety, their freedom, essentially. There's a lot riding on this. And what we see is Steve emotionally manipulating Judy to protect him. And through doing that, through arguments that we see, the back and forth, the yelling, there's a lot of criticizing, there's a lot of calling Judy crazy, and a lot of other belittling names.
So one of the examples I think like that I'm remembering of where I'm seeing this emotional manipulation is I think that Steve comes to Judy's work and they're having this argument. And we see this very unusual argument where Steve says something to Judy and he puts her down, or he belittles her, he calls her a name, and Judy says very quickly, "Don't do that, don't say that, don't call me that," or some version of that. And very quickly we hear Steve say, "I'm sorry," and Judy go, "It's okay," and just like brush it off. And it happens over and over again. While Steve calls her a name, Judy says, "Don't do that." He says, "I'm sorry." She says, "It's okay." And this like, I don't remember how many times, but I want to say like 5 or 6 times in this one conversation, which is very unusual.
Oh my God. You are nuts.
Don't do that.
Sorry.
It's okay.
We are so far past that right now.
Don't yell at me.
Sorry.
It's okay.
What it makes me think of is our apology phase in our cycle of abuse, where after some sort of incident, after some sort of like Steve calling her a name, there's always an apology. And then immediately following, there's this honeymoon phase where it feels like everything's going to be okay and it's never going to happen again. And
Hmm.
I think maybe in the beginning of their relationship, which again is something that we don't see, those apologies can be much, much bigger. And after an incident, the apology can be sort of grand and lengthy and very genuine. But what we see is years into their relationship, or maybe after their relationship is ended, in the case of Steve and Judy, it's not a very genuine apology. It's just sort of quick,
Yeah.
it's like brushed off. Judy's Judy's very used to having to say to Steve, don't do that or don't call me that, which makes me think that it happens very frequently and all the time, right? Like this sort of I'm sorry, it's okay pattern didn't seem weird to them. And so it makes me think that
No.
it's a common theme throughout their relationship, this sort of Steve calling her names and then very quickly moving into, I'm sorry, it's okay, and just brushing it off
Yeah.
and moving right on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that you mentioned is really apparent in their relationship too, at least from Judy's perspective, which is that pattern and that assumption that things will get better after an apology. And like you mentioned, maybe in the beginning of a relationship it did for a while. And and Judy even mentions, spoiler alert right now, in season 2, after Judy and Jen bury Steve's body out in the woods somewhere, she explains to Jen, I know who he is. I loved him. And what that highlights is there were genuine feelings of love from Judy to Steve. That love was genuine, that love was real. And but that love was also used against Judy herself from Steve. And that's all a part of that pattern and that cycle of abuse. Doesn't mean that it wasn't there. It just means that it wasn't felt equally between the two partners, which
Mm,
is really the issue there.
yeah. No, I think you make a good point that we can really see or hear the emotional manipulation when we listen to what Judy says about their relationship, right? We hear Judy go on to refer to their relationship or refer to her feelings towards Steve as an addiction. And
Yeah.
I that doesn't feel very healthy to me. And I don't think that people who are in a healthy relationship refer to their love as an addiction, right? When I think of an addiction, I'm also thinking about the cycle that a person struggling with addiction goes through, right? It doesn't, i think I think her expression of like, I know who he is but I love him, or it's an addiction, I keep going back, she's aware of the unhealthy nature of their relationship, she's aware of that cycle, but she's being very vulnerable in like, I know it but I love him, and that love keeps her in that relationship.
Absolutely. And I think putting all of this into the scope of how us as viewers meet Judy and Steve, um, we can understand that Steve is really using the car crash and that hit and run as a way to manipulate and further control Judy. So we met them and they were broken up. And but as soon as we learn that Judy was the driver of this car and that Steve was the passenger, and then when Steve learns that Jen and Judy are now friends, that's really where like all of the action kind of kicks up between the two, and they are interacting a lot more, so we are able to see the emotional manipulation that happens within that. And that scene that I'm thinking about, which really highlights it, is when Judy is talking to Steve at her place of work, I think it was, and she's explaining her reasoning for befriending Jen. And Steve goes off and he's calling her crazy. He's saying this is not what a normal person would do. What good could come out of this relationship? Really just disregarding her feelings and her emotions and nearly her whole reality on and perspective on what this situation is.
Right.
He's disregarding it and belittling her in the process. And that's a big part of emotional manipulation, because after that occurs enough times, then the only perspective that an individual can trust is of the person that's telling you that your perspective is wrong.
Yeah, we see Judy start to really question her own reality. She's unsure of what's true, and she's been told that she's crazy so many times that even she starts to believe it. She starts to describe herself as crazy, because how could she not think that when there's somebody constantly telling you that that's the truth and that's reality? And we see Steve not only try to control Judy's perspective and Judy's reality, but what we also start to see is Steve trying to manipulate and control other people's perception of Judy, right? Once at various times, I think Steve starts to feel like he's losing power over Judy, and in an effort to get Judy back or get her close to him or gain that power and control over Judy again, he wants to control the perception of other people, and he wants to isolate Judy so that he can have her all to himself. Right, I'm thinking about when Judy goes to Steve's office and she thinks that she's pregnant, and she's trying to tell Steve that she's pregnant, and Judy is so blindsided that there's a woman there who is saying that she's Steve's girlfriend, and she in fact is pregnant, and that they've been in a relationship. All the while Steve is like trying to get Judy to come back to him and move out of Jen's house, and ends up sleeping with her and sort of leads her on that he's interested in getting back together with her. And then Judy shows up, and it's like, again, her reality is completely just irrelevant and totally in question. And like, what was that interaction between her and Steve this whole time, if all the while he was with another woman and that was his girlfriend? Really, the only reason that I can see is to get Judy out of Jen's house and continue to isolate her. You know, it's like that, if you can't be with me, then you can't be with anybody else kind of attitude. He wants Judy all to himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up a good point of what that is doing with isolating Judy, because ultimately his goal is self-preservation. And we, as viewers, we were strung along with Judy herself. We thought that we didn't know whether Steve's emotions were real or not. I think for me as a viewer, I felt off about it. I didn't trust Steve as a character at all from what we have seen him anyway. But it came as a shock to me when his other girlfriend showed up, because you saw on Judy's face just everything was shattered, everything fell apart around her, and she had to rebuild what the truth was. But all at the same time, that was really hard, because the whole time Steve has been telling her what the truth is. Why would you doubt somebody when they're consistently telling you, I love you so much, just come back, move in with me, things were so great back then, don't you want to go back to how it was? Of course she does. You know, she loved him, why wouldn't she? And what that was doing the whole time, we come to find out, is really just, like you mentioned, trying to maintain that control over Judy, and with that comes the protection of himself. So he can't get in trouble for being the passenger in that car when Judy hit Jen's husband.
Right.
It all comes back to that self-preservation and protection. And with that comes straight into him continuing to try to control others' thoughts and perspectives of who Judy is. At the end of the show, or at the end of the first season, that is, when Judy and Jen have had their argument because Judy just came clean about killing her husband. Jen understandably doesn't want anything to do with her at that moment. So Judy leaves, and that's after she has already turned Steve in to the police for money laundering. So what we see from Steve is ultimately what I can classify as just lacking all control. Like all of these decisions and this whole facade of who he is and everything is crumbling around him, and he's scrounging, trying to gain control. And he shows up at Jen's house, demands to see Judy, doesn't believe Jen when she tells him, I have no idea where she is. And we see what he has done with Judy over and over throughout the show, he does with Jen. So he comes in like guns blazing, he's ready to have an argument ultimately, and then once he realizes that's not getting what he wants, he changes his tactic and changes his moves. He goes into, oh, Judy's so crazy, I told you, wherever Judy goes, chaos follows, and really trying to say to Jen, look, we have this shared connection of Judy and her craziness. But quickly we see Jen not buying it. And then it goes into that aggression again. And he's really trying to control through Jen, Judy. He's trying to get back to Judy so he can assert his power and control over the situation and try to fix whatever she has done, right?
Right. Yeah, Steve had already tried to isolate Judy from Jen through Judy and trying to convince her to move out of Jen's house and convince her to come back to him. And that didn't work. And so now what he's doing is trying to isolate Judy through Jen. He's going to go to Jen and tell Jen how crazy she is. And like you said, chaos follows her. He wants to control that perception. We see this power imbalance between Steve and Judy all throughout any of the flashbacks that we get, any of the present day scenes that we see between the two of them. It's so apparent, right? And I think one of the biggest instances of this power imbalance that I can think of, if we're keeping in mind all of this manipulation and this power and control that Steve continuously tries to grab, I'm thinking about the scene, the point in the show where Steve moves the car that was used to hit Ted and ultimately murder Ted that they were driving that night. They've got it in a storage locker and it's safe somewhere. And at some point during the show, Steve moves the car without telling Judy. Right. And I'm reflecting on this power imbalance, and I have to wonder what would have happened if Judy had moved the car without telling Steve.
Yeah.
Because the conflict after Steve moves the car without telling Judy doesn't escalate to very much. Ultimately, Steve's able to talk his way out of it. Steve's able to convince Judy that it was out of love and romance and trying to like cover up what happened to them.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what that conflict would have looked like if it had been the other way around, right? Judy at no point had equal power or control in the relationship as Steve. And so I think that conflict would have escalated so much further if those roles had been reversed.
And what's interesting about that too is we get a little taste, I guess, of what that role reversal would have looked like And we see that from when Judy eventually tells Steve, I've befriended Jen. That was a decision that Judy made without Steve to rectify her own guilt and her own feelings about what had happened. And we see Steve furious over it. And like we mentioned earlier, that's really where their relationship and their interactions continue and begin. And so we already kind of know what would happen.
You know where else we see an example of like that role reversal? When
Uh-huh.
when Judy takes all of the money out of their account without telling Steve that she's going to do that.
Yeah.
And then later in season 2, I think it's in season 2, when we hear the voicemails that Steve left for Judy, and
Yes.
Steve is screaming, he's furious, he's cursing her out, he's calling her names, like
Threatening her.
Yeah. So I think we do get a glimpse of like what conflict would have looked like.
I'm sorry. I love you. You please call me back. I just need to talk to you. I need you. Come on, Jude. You're not gonna get away with this, Judy. You're the f***ing angel. You can't hide forever, and when I f***ing find you, I am going to f***ing kill you. You hear me? You are f***ing dead.
If those roles were reversed, and we're right, like that escalation would have happened so fast, and it would have been this major conflict, and there's just such an apparent power imbalance in this relationship.
Absolutely. And I think as a viewer, we know that, like we see it the whole time, but might not know how to articulate that or understand like what is really happening. I think especially with emotional manipulation, we don't recognize it's happening when it's happening.
Yeah.
It's the hardest to see. And that's because it's tugging at our own emotions. And we see Judy's journey through all of that.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So that's Judy and Steve.
Judy and Steve from Dead to Me.
Well, thank you everybody for watching with us
much.
today and going on this journey with us today. Tell us what you want to see next. Tell us what relationships you want to talk about. Comment here. Talk to us. We want to know
Comment
what
below.
you want to see. All right.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.